And go to slideshow. Okay, so welcome again to the African Plants Georeferencing Train the Trainers workshop. Today is the second day of the intensive full course and what we're calling Module 2. So the first topic for today in this presentation that I'll be giving is Darwin Core and georeferencing. Remember that we've seen Darwin Core already in the pre-course. We even had some exercises to do with it. Just a reminder, Darwin Core is the most popular standard for sharing biodiversity data. And today we're going to be talking about how it's used specifically for georeferencing. So again, this is a bit of a reminder. You've seen this in the previous video for the pre-course on standards in general and Darwin Core in particular. Darwin Core is a standard under the standards body called Biodiversity Information Standards, which is more popularly known as TADWIG, or the Taxonomic Databases Working Group, which is how it was named in its very origins. Darwin Core is most accessible via this document called the Darwin Core Quick Reference Guide. This isn't actually the standards document itself, not the normative standards document, but it's the human readable one that is the most accessible. And this is the one that you should probably refer to first. It should answer all of the questions. So a bit of a reminder, what is Darwin Core? It's a list of terms, basically, with their definitions and how those are related to biodiversity data. More than that, it is not. Sometimes it will be confused with something called a Darwin Core archive, and that's just a means for sharing data using Darwin Core fields and their definitions as text files. So it's one way to use Darwin Core in practice. So in Darwin Core, the terms are organized in categories that help us to understand really what the fields are about. So there's a record set level, there are fields about occurrences, about organisms, about material samples, events, locations, geological context, identifications, and taxa. And then there are also a couple of auxiliary classes that have to be used in a slightly different way from the others. And those are for relating things together, for making measurements of those things, or for providing chronometric ages. Today, we're going to be talking specifically about the terms in the Darwin Core location class. And we're going to do that by dividing and conquering into these categories of terms within the location class. These categories are not formal in any way. We're just using them today to try to separate parts of a very large class of terms. So when I say large, there are 44 terms in the Darwin Core location class as of today. And that is the class with the most terms in it. And it's largely because of the georeferencing terms. So the first thing we're going to do is talk about the identifiers. There are two of them. There's the location ID and there's a higher geography ID. I'm not going to be reading the definitions of terms as we go through this presentation because they are, first of all, available in the Darwin Core Quick Reference Guide. And second of all, they have been covered in some capacity already in previous presentations. The identifiers are terms that allow us to make a connection to data that are online, basically. So the slide showing here is a page that you get from OpenStreetMap when you link to that URL on the bottom. So that URL is a unique way of getting to the information about this place. This particular place is a town, and that identifier is a way to get all of its information. So that's what we mean by an identifier. In this case, it's a location ID. Another example from a completely different source is Tambacounda, which is a region in Senegal. And in this case, at the very bottom, you can see an identifier. And this identifier is from the Getty Thesaurus of Geographic Names. Again, it's a URL, and therefore it uniquely identifies the place. And it has the nice characteristic that not only does it identify the place, but if you click on that link, it takes you to all of the information about the place. So that's what we mean by these identifiers when they're used in their most capable means. That is, via something that it resolves to more information on the internet. So let's talk a little bit about identifiers in general. If you are to provide identifiers, the best practice is to provide globally unique ones that are going to persist through time and are resolvable. When I say resolvable, it's just like those two that we saw, those two examples we just saw, where if you go to the identifier, you get back more information. So the ideal identifier is one that's globally unique, persistent, and resolvable. If possible, reuse any existing identifiers. That is, find the places that in an existing authority like the Getty Thesaurus and use those identifiers rather than making up new ones for those places. I can hear some sound coming from somewhere. Can you please mute? Okay, so in the case where you're producing a location record and you don't have any identifiers available, another practice could be to create new ones, to uniquely identify a record, a location record in your data set. And one way to do that is with a universal ID, a UUID. And those can be randomly generated with online services and then plugged into your spreadsheet or your database. So if you can't, or it doesn't make sense in your context to provide identifiers, just leave those fields empty. Don't make up something simple, because the likelihood is that those will not end up being unique when data are shared in a global context. So now we're going to skip to the bottom of this list of categories to the other data, because there are just a couple of them and we can get through them rather quickly and out of the way. The first of these is the location according to. So this is a concept where to capture the source for a location, for example, the ones that we just saw identifiers for. So remember that the second of my examples was a region in Senegal, and that was from the Getty Thesaurus of Geographic Names. So if you included that identifier for a location ID, then you would want to put Getty Thesaurus of Geographic Names here in the location according to field. That tells people, separate from the identifier, where that ID came from. And then we have location remarks. Location remarks is meant to capture information about the place. And we're going to distinguish that from a different remark, and I'll talk about that here in a second. So, location according to, when we talk about this, this is a reference to every bit of information in the location record. So the location ID refers to the combination of every one of those 44 fields, not just one part of it. In natural history collections, this field is often filled by a collector's name, or even perhaps by a curator's name. They're the ones who provided the information in the location record. If data have been altered, then the field location according to should contain the names of or the source from which the very latest version of the entire location record was provided. And then, if the record has also been georeferenced, that is, the georeferencing fields have been filled in, then it should contain the name of the people who did the georeferencing, because they are the ones who provided the very latest and most specific information about the location. And in such a case, the location according to and the georeferenced by fields would have the same value, because they were the last person to touch both the georeference and the location in general. Location remarks, I alluded to, should include comments about the location that is separate from the georeference. And the reason is that the georeference part has its own remarks term, georeference remarks. And we'll get to georeference remarks in a minute as well, to try to distinguish between those two things and what would be appropriate for each one. Then let's go back to the second category, and this one's fairly simple. It's the category of geographic data. These are the terms that are the very broad descriptors of place. So for all of the geographic terms, you're invited to use any language of your choice, but it would be ideal to be consistent across the record and across your data set. So that is to say, even though this is a standards body, and you might expect that a recommendation is for these terms to be filled in with, for example, English, that's not the case. In fact, it's best if it's filled in with a term that is exactly as it should be in the place where the record occurs, or in the data set where it occurs. Sorry. Excuse me. The first of the terms in the geographic data, the highest level or most broad term, is the continent. And in this case, what we have is an expected controlled vocabulary. If you look at the examples, you can see a list of 7 terms. And those are the ones we ideally like the continent field to be filled with. All the rest of the terms also recommend a controlled vocabulary. If you look in the comments, and you can see that here, this upper part for country is an exact extract, an image copied from the from the Darwin Core Quick Reference Guide. And the comments in these cases say the recommended best practice is to use the controlled vocabulary, such as the Getty Thesaurus of Geographic Names. So the Getty Thesaurus is nice in that not only does it include the names of countries in English, it includes the names of countries in various languages. And so it's perfectly viable to use the country name as used in that country. Country code is another term where a controlled vocabulary is recommended, in fact, highly recommended, and very specifically recommended to be the ISO 2-letter country code, specifically the 2-letter one. There are 3-letter country codes, but we want to minimize it to the 2-letter country code, because the 3-letter one adds nothing except another letter. All of the country codes are available both in 2-letter and 3-letter, so we determine that the 3-letter one is excessive, and we use the 2-letter one. Then we have variations on country names. It's best to use the names that are included in some authority, that they can be found, that they're official in some way, and it's best to be consistent across the data set about how the country names are used. I've already mentioned that the country code expresses the same information that the country name does in most cases, and that it's a code that is independent of any sovereignty claims. And the country codes contain things that aren't necessarily countries, like the island of Réunion, and you will encounter situations where a country is filled with a value of a place that no longer exists on the map today. And in such cases, there won't be an ISO 2-letter country code. One example that comes to mind for this is Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia has been divided up into many different countries, and all of those countries have ISO codes, and Yugoslavia does not. So Yugoslavia could go into the country names field, but the more specific actual current country would go into the country code field. Then a final note is that when the country is not known, or if there are multiple countries that the location refers to, then we use the code ZZ, which isn't an actual ISO country code, but it's sort of reserved for this purpose of signifying unknown, and we want to use that. So what that means is we always want to fill the country code field. Then we have several fields, 3 more, that are meant to allow us to capture information about successively more specific administrative levels within the country. So unfortunately, for the history of Darwin Core, these 3 terms have names that suggest a particular type of administrative boundary, such as a state or a province. Whereas the world over, the first level administrative unit might be a canton, it might be a region, it might be a department. The names of the type of first level administrative boundaries vary throughout the world. The point is that these 3 are successively more specific. So state province is the biggest one inside of a country, then comes county, the second level, and third comes municipality. And the important thing is not to confuse municipality necessarily with a town. Then we have a sort of a catch-all term, the higher geography. What this allows is basically for us to capture using, if you look in the second example there, using a syntax that separates different levels of geographic hierarchy from each other with a space followed by a vertical bar followed by another space. So in these cases, what it allows us to do is to repeat all of the higher geographic terms that we've seen just now, like continent, country, state, province, county, municipality, but also interject into that list in the appropriate hierarchical places other administrative units that the other Darwin Core terms can't accommodate. So in that second example on this page, you can see Parque Nacional Nahuel Huapi. That's a national park. And it's bigger, that is, it crosses more territories than the next level down, which is actually a province. And it's smaller than the next level up, which is kind of an unofficial but well-known region in South America called Patagonia. So the point here is that higher geography allows you to capture more information about place than the individual terms in Darwin Core do. Then we get into the other administrative or geographical specific terms that aren't administrative within a country necessarily. The first of these is water body. And what you want to do here is oftentimes water bodies will be hierarchical as well. So one type of water body within another type of water body and so on. We want to use the value that is the most specific one. And if the original data have no information in this field and no other information indicates that the place or location was aquatic in any way, we want the water body to be left empty. Then we have the 2 terms that are related to islands, the island group and the island. So with these, throughout the world, there are so very many islands and island groups can also be arranged hierarchically, just as water bodies can. And so the same island might belong to different groups, but at different scales. And again, with the same philosophy as water body, what we want to do is capture the most specific island group that an island belongs to in a hierarchy. And another thing about the term island is we want to be careful to provide in that term the actual name and not necessarily the name with the word island or île or whatever equivalent in other languages to the actual name, except where it's absolutely necessary in order to understand the place. So the example that is here at the bottom of this slide is Long Island. If we were to provide just the word long, it would be confusing, especially since the name of the actual place is Long Island with that word in it. In other cases, like Reunion, it's an island, but you wouldn't put the word island at the end of it because that's not its name. So I hope that's clear. After we get through those terms that are higher level in geographic, we get to two terms that are the most specific terms that aren't coordinates. The first of these is the locality, and the second is the verbatim locality. So the two terms are separate from each other because what we basically want to do is capture always as close to the original description of a place that we have. So if we have the information in a field notebook from out in the field, ideally, what's written in that notebook ends up in the term verbatim locality. And verbatim locality can contain the entire hierarchy or set of terms that you find in the location class. If it was written down, it should go in there. On the other hand, the locality field can be the same thing if it has not been interpreted or changed in any way. But alternatively, it could be an interpreted version of the verbatim locality information after taking out all of the higher geographic terms that can go into other fields in Darwin Core. So, for example, if we were to take the country Argentina and the province of Rio Negro, where we live, and the town of San Carlos de Bariloche, where we live, then the higher geography could contain the country name, the province name in the state province field, and we would leave the town name where we live in the locality field because it's the most specific part of the locality description and of the whole location. So the locality field basically can be stripped down. The verbatim locality field cannot. That must contain things as close to the original as possible, even if they're misspellings. Okay. So we pose a question here that if the original locality information hasn't been modified, can't we just put that information in verbatim locality and leave the locality field empty? The answer is we could, but Darwin Core has a basic principle that is, if you are able to fill a Darwin Core field, then you should fill that Darwin Core field. And that's why the recommendation is to actually provide information in both fields. The second question is, can locality and verbatim locality contain administrative divisions and other data? Well, yes, they can. But as I said, the locality field could be stripped of those. The verbatim locality should not. And it's highly recommended that the corresponding fields, like the water body and the country and the state province, etc., would be filled in as well. So now we go quickly to the vertical components of the location class. So on Monday, you will have seen in some detail what these vertical components are and how they should be used and interpreted. These are the diagrams that came from the presentation on geographic concepts about the elevation, depth, and distance above surface in meters. So this category of location terms are divided up into three. There are three different aspects of vertical components that are required in order to be able to describe any place in a vertical system. The first is elevation. We've seen this in detail. The second is the depth. And the third are this pair of terms that describe a distance above a surface. So just a quick review of those things. For any of these fields, if for example, elevation is at a specific elevation, there's no range, there's no uncertainty in it, then we would have basically one value for elevation, but we want to record it in both the minimum and maximum. This is a manifestation again of the Darwin core principle of filling every field that you possibly can. The idea is to be complete, to be consistent, to be unambiguous. If we were to leave one of those fields blank, it would not be very clear if the minimum was known and the maximum was not known, for example. So if we do know the minimum maximum are the same, fill them both in. Those terms, and it's true for all of these terms that are not verbatim, they should not contain units. They should be numbers. The minimum and maximum values should be numbers. Remember that on land, the reference point is the elevation at ground level. For a water body, the elevation would be the surface of the water, the top surface where it meets the air. And then for locations within a water body, depth is the distance below that air-water interface, and depths must always be positive or zero. You can't have a negative depth. Now we get into the very meat of what this course is about, and that is trying retrospectively, usually, to fill in the data about the georeference, that is the spatial representation of what is descriptive information in the rest of the location class. So georeferencing fields, there are many. The first of these are those that capture the coordinates in the format that we would like to share them globally. In other words, we always want to have a decimal latitude and decimal longitude if we can. Along with those, wherever we've been provided with coordinates in the source, we want to capture those coordinates exactly as they were in the source. And there are three fields for that: verbatim latitude, verbatim longitude, and verbatim coordinates. Excuse me. Accompanying those three verbatim coordinate type fields is a term for verbatim coordinate system. And that one's meant to capture what was the format that the original coordinates were in. So examples are degrees, decimal degrees, or degrees, minutes, seconds. So some considerations about coordinates. We always want to capture the original coordinates exactly as they were recorded. We don't want to try to fix them. And the general reason for this is the same as for all verbatim fields, that anything that we touch has the potential to create an error. So even if it looks like the original has an error, keep the error, because it might be our misinterpretation. And to do anything else except keep it is to lose information. So the second thing is be careful about conversions. Our verbatim terms should be captured as strings, not as numbers, because if we capture them as numbers, our databases and spreadsheets can do terrible things to them, like truncate the precision or try to turn it into a floating point number, which makes the number of digits very long and not representative. And those sorts of things are called the introduction of false precision. So keep them as strings. And then when you convert from those verbatim coordinates into other types of coordinate systems, like the decimal degrees of the decimal latitude and decimal longitude, it's recommended to keep 7 decimal places of precision. Later on, we're going to talk about accuracy and precision and false precision and how to be careful about those things. The reason, very briefly, why to keep 7 decimal places is that if you do, you can transfer back and forth as many times as you like between coordinate formats without losing information, without losing the actual location, without having it drift at the level of a single meter. That's the basic reason for 7 decimal places. We've seen, and we're going to hammer this over and over, that without a geodetic datum, that is, without a coordinate reference system, coordinates actually don't mean anything. They could be many different places, depending on the underlying coordinate reference system. So without this information, we're basically introducing a very large component of possible errors. Always have the datum if possible. And if you don't know it, then we want to make sure that it's recorded that you don't know it. And the value to use to record that you don't know it is the word unknown. Consider that to be a control vocabulary value for a datum or coordinate reference system that we don't know. This was brought up earlier in the presentation on geographic concepts. WGS84, those 5 characters, can actually refer to 3 different things. They can refer to a full coordinate reference system, such as EPSG 4326, which means a coordinate reference system that uses decimal degrees on the WGS84 datum. So the datum is a second EPSG code, the 6326, and it's the underlying model. And it could be represented in all kinds of formats. The specific one for decimal degrees is that EPSG 4326 above it. That's the one that we're looking to try to share data in, but we don't always have the original data in that way. And then finally, WGS84 can refer to the underlying ellipsoid that is part of the definition of the WGS84 datum. And that just means what was the shape that underlies the datum. And then the datum says, okay, where are we going to put the origin and how are we going to orient it? And then the coordinate reference system says, okay, on top of that, we're going to say decimal degrees. So be careful when talking about WGS84. It can mean 3 different things. There are 3 levels of specificity. So if you know the coordinate reference system, that's the best thing, because if you do, you also know what the datum is. And if you know what the datum is, you also know what the ellipsoid is. And the ellipsoid is the thing that helps us to determine how far things are apart on the top of that model. The reverse may not be true. You can know the ellipsoid, but if you don't know its orientation and origin, you actually can't determine where the coordinates are. You can determine how far things are apart in a system with those coordinates, but you can't determine where they are. The final component of a good georeference is this term called the coordinate uncertainty in meters. So again, this is a number. It contains no units, and it's a way for us to capture in a single digit how big is the place we're talking about. That is, sometimes it refers just to the size, but also it can refer to how well we know where the place is. It's a measure of uncertainty. If the uncertainty is known, unknown, or it can't be estimated, or if there aren't any coordinates, this field should be left empty. It has no meaning unless there are coordinates, and that this uncertainty can actually be calculated. Note that even if you do a georeference and it's perfect, there's no such thing as a coordinate uncertainty in meters of 0. It's not possible. No place on the planet has 0 size, and we can't measure it to within no uncertainties. So keep that in mind. 0 is not a valid value for a coordinate uncertainty in meters. Any description of a place has many sources of uncertainty, and as we've seen briefly, and as we will see in detail later, that every description introduces uncertainties in one way or another. That includes GPS. One might be tempted to think that GPS is the savior of all descriptions of place, but no, not only does it have its own inaccuracies, but if it's not used correctly, it can introduce terrible uncertainties. So it's not the savior we might have thought. Beyond those, we get into other georeference terms like the coordinate precision. This one is descriptive. And what it does is it describes to us the level of precision that was provided in the coordinates that end up being given in decimal latitude and decimal longitude. And you can see in the examples that they are all numbers, and they are numbers that are given in decimal degrees. So look at that second example. It's for the nearest second, but it's a number that if you put it in a nearest second into decimal degrees would be 1 divided by 60 divided by 60, or 1 over 360. So that's how the coordinate precision works. Again, when you transform a coordinate precision, we want to keep 7 decimal places, just as we did with the coordinates that we were transforming. Quickly on this one, the verbatim SRS is the coordinate system in which our verbatim coordinates were given. So those might be in WGS84, just as the ones that we're trying to share might be, but they might be different. And that might be that a transformation was required between these original coordinate reference system coordinates and our decimal degrees that we share in the end. Then there are some terms that are complicated, and we're not going to be calculating these except in the specific case of GeoPick, which can do it for us, but they're interesting to know about. There are 2 of them that are spatial fits. One of them is for the point radius. Basically, this is just a measure of how well the point radius represents the actual location that's underneath it. And we'll see how that might be used in one of the later presentations today. The next field is footprint WKT. This is the place in Darwin Core where you can capture geometries like polygons or polylines. And it's done in a particular format called the well-known text format. That's why the WKT. The example shows a very simple polygon, which is a bounding box. That's what it looks like in WKT. Here's an example that basically you can then describe the boundaries of a town like this one using well-known text. And basically what it is providing the coordinates for every one of those nodes, every little corner, every little dot on that image. And so since a given location can have more than one representation, you could provide, for example, the shape of the little town like this in WKT, in the footprint WKT field, and on top of that, you could provide a point radius for it. Both representations could be useful. Along with the footprint WKT comes the footprint SRS. This is like the verbatim SRS, the value that you want to accompany the shape, telling us what coordinate reference system it is in, because it may be distinct from the others. Again, footprint spatial fit, like the point radius spatial fit, is a measure of how well does the polygon that we're providing represent the actual place. So just to get a quick idea of that, look in the image B. You can see a simplified polygon around the more complex polygon. If we take the complex polygon as the true representation of the place, then the simple one that circumscribes it contains more area than the original. And the spatial fit would represent how much bigger the outer circumscribing polygon is than the inner one. Basically, it's telling us how good of a job is the polygon that was provided. Then the final category of terms in the location class are the georeference metadata. In general, these are the terms that allow anybody who receives your georeference to try to reproduce it. So this tells us who did it and when it was done. Those are very straightforward. Then it gets into the really important stuff like the protocol that was used and what sources were used. So the protocol is, for us, more often than not, going to be the Georeferencing Quick Reference Guide. If you look in the examples on this screen, on this image, that's exactly the citation that we want to go into the georeference protocol when we use the Georeferencing Quick Reference Guide. The sources may vary. We might be using Google Maps or Google Earth or Geolocate or GeoPick. Those are all possible sources for information, and oftentimes we're going to be using more than one. And if we do, then we want to list them all and separate them with this pattern of space, vertical bar, space. And then finally, I promised that we would get to the georeference remarks versus the location remarks. The georeference remarks field is specifically for us to comment about things that we had to take into consideration when we did the georeference. So maybe we had to make an assumption that was different from the protocol, or that we had some reason to believe that one interpretation was a better one to make than what might normally have been chosen. And so that's where we want to put this information. A good example you can see here is that it was assumed that the distance given was by road. You might otherwise have interpreted the locality to be by air, but in your case, you had a good reason to think it was by road, and so you made that choice. You want to capture that information in georeference remarks. How is that different from the location remarks? The georeference remarks is specifically about your spatial interpretation of the rest of the location class. The location remarks are about the location itself. So I know that in the pre-course, several people provided location remarks that were very interesting that we hadn't even thought of, that are about the place. For example, the Aswan Dam example, there was a location just downstream of the Aswan Dam. So some people provided information about when the dam was built. So that location was affected by the dam having been built just upstream of it. That's a perfectly good location remark. It's about the place, not about our geospatial interpretation of it. So I hope that gets across the difference between those two things. Then there's the tricky bit. There's a term that has the word georeference in it, but it's not actually a term about the location class. And the reason for this is that this is a statement that a georeference has been verified at the level of, say, a specimen, not at the level of a location. So it means I've gone into my herbarium, somebody's provided me with a georeference based on the location. I look at that georeference now in the context of my herbarium sheet and the specimen that's on it. And I assess whether the georeference is as good as it can be for this specimen. If it is, then I can say so, that perhaps I'm the curator, and I can say, I have verified as a curator that this georeference is as good as we're able to make it. Now, it could be even better if you're able to talk to the collector, have the collector look at the georeference for their specimen on a map and tell you that it can't be any better than that. It's as specific as it could possibly be, and it's in the right place. That's the ideal. It means that if you look at the list of examples, it's in the category of the very last one, verified by the contributor. So there's a statement at the bottom of this slide that says, if you're working with locations only, do not use this term. And the reason is we aren't applying any of our georeference information at the level of specimens in our project at this stage. We're only doing it at the level of unique localities that we're getting to do the georeferencing on. So I hope that's clear. It's a term about the occurrence, not about the location, and we won't be providing it. So there are some summary messages that we need to look at from all of this. One is that really being familiar with and understanding the terms of the Darwin Core is useful. I would say it's essential. Some of the Darwin Core terms recommend control vocabularies. When that is the case, you should use those controlled vocabulary values. And then finally, there are also some terms that recommend constraints. The easy one to think of is the decimal latitude and longitude. They must be within the appropriate limits. So when there are constraints, follow them. Another one, good one to remember, was the coordinate uncertainty in meters. It can't be 0. Don't make it 0. So finally, again, returning to the Darwin Core principle about providing as much information as possible. That is, fill in everything that you possibly can without making things up. You shouldn't provide information that you don't know to be the case. You should provide information that is verifiable. So, for example, you have been given a country name and it's unambiguously Senegal. You can provide the country code for Senegal in the country code field. That's the idea here. The more we fill in, the more uses the data have when they're shared. And that's the reason for doing this. Then, when georeferencing, and especially when dealing with historical records, sometimes you have to make decisions about what information to capture, how to capture, and sometimes some of it needs modification. And when you make those decisions, you have to document them. In other words, what you have done needs to be reproducible by other people. And then finally, just to hammer it home the one last time, you always keep the original information. And that allows things to be checked all the way back to the origin, anytime in the future, during any georeferencing process or any georeferencing review. So I hope that was all good and clear, and that you can take all these messages to heart as we move forward into the more and more detailed parts of how to do the georeferencing. Thank you for that. I'll stop sharing now.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, John, for the presentation. We had on the chat a question. I don't know if you can see it, but it was if we can better explain or explain again the difference between island and island group, if you can get back to that.
Sure. Island an island group are two levels of division for island features. So let's take as an example, let's take as an example the Canary Islands. The Canary Islands are an island group. And within that island group, there are no sub-island groups of which I am aware. But there are islands within it, like Tenerife. So Tenerife would be a perfectly good example of an island value, with its island group being the Canary Islands. Does that explain the difference between those two? Is that what the question was about?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that again?
Sure. The island is for a specific island. No multiplicity in that field. Whereas the island group is the name of the larger set of islands of which your island is a member. So I was using Canary Islands as an example. The Canary Islands is an island group that has lots of islands in it, and one of the islands in it, the value of which would go in an island field, is Tenerife. Sometimes there are island groups within island groups. And in such cases, we want to keep the more specific island group in the island group field. This because if you know the more specific island group, you know that it's part of the larger island group, and you don't need to say that about the larger one. The smaller one captures more information for us.
All right, thank you.
Welcome.
If you want to see it graphically, we can, let me share my screen a second. If you can see it there, this is just a draft that I just made, but then you can think of all these little almost circles or shapes here as, for example, an archipelago, right? And so within that whole group of islands, you may have subgroups of islands. So you can have an island group that includes them all, and small island groups that includes some of those, and then you have the individual islands, each of these. So for island, as John was saying, is a single one, but for island groups, you might have this group, which is in turn part of a larger group. You have to always try to put the most specific one.
I wish I could come up quickly with a good example for Africa. But the Canary Islands was the only one that I could think of quickly, and it only has one level of island groups in it. In the Indian Ocean, there are other groupings, things like Mauritius, that are parts of larger island groups, but I don't remember the names of them, so that's not very helpful. One of which I am very familiar is the island groups in Alaska. So there's a very long chain of islands that extends from the mainland of Alaska all the way to Siberia. And the name of the whole long chain is the Aleutian Islands. Within the Aleutian Islands, there are many different groupings at various different levels. There are the West Aleutian Islands and the East Aleutian Islands that have a very specific dividing point. And then within them, there are other groups of islands like the Rat Islands and the Pribilof Islands that are just parts of those very long chain of islands. In the Philippines, the same thing. In Indonesia, the same thing. These island countries have various levels of island groups, and we'd always like to capture the most specific one we can.
So, John, there's another question on the chat from Nestor that says, at which moment we need to use precision?
At which moment do we need to use precision? That's kind of a tricky question. I'll try to be complete about it. The coordinate precision field we want to fill anytime that we can. Suppose that we do a georeference, and the georeference is based on a georeferencing calculator, and the result is a combination of using a starting point and going some distance in some direction from that starting point. And the answer is a new place, and the calculator gives us the answer with 7 digits of precision, using that recommendation about precision for keeping coordinates so that they can be transformed back and forth between formats. That answer from the georeferencing calculator contains 7 digits of precision. And so we would fill our coordinate precision field with 0.000001. That is 6 zeros and a 1 in the 7th digit. That's for that specific case. Let's take another case. Suppose we're given verbatim coordinates, and the verbatim coordinates are to the nearest degree. So there are no decimal places filled in to the right of those numbers. They're just integers. In this case, we base our georeference on the verbatim original coordinates, which are with a precision of nearest degree. If we convert that to coordinate precision in degrees, we get the number 1. It's 1 degree of precision. So coordinate precision will be filled with 1, because our answer, our georeference, is no more precise than that original, and that's what we would provide. Now, it could be that that actual value, those integers, when put into a spreadsheet or into a database, end up looking like an integer followed by 7 digits of precision. But those are all zeros. And those are all what we call false precision. They have no meaning with respect to our understanding of the place, which is to the nearest degree. The lesson here is, do not pay any attention to false precision as a measure of our understanding of how specific the place is. It can't be trusted, which is why we put in coordinate precision. By actually filling in coordinate precision, we're telling people how specific the original was, no matter what a database or a spreadsheet does to it after the fact. So that covers kind of the full range of what precision is about and what to be careful about. But does it answer your specific question? Okay.
Seems so. Anyway, we can go back to this as many times as you need. And we will repeat these concepts all over the next modules. So you will have ample opportunity to re-ask and revisit the concepts.
Remember, on the other end of this course, you will be trainers. You will know all these things as well as we do, and you'll be able to tell other people.
Okay, so if there are no other questions for now, I propose that we take a break, 10 minutes break, and then we continue with the next 2 topics for today, which are georeferencing methods and georeferencing best practices. So I will keep the session running and live streaming. I will trim it after. Someone has a question. You want to type it, or if you want to open up your microphone, it's also possible.
the previous pre-course exercise we're given, we're told to fill in some information from what we're given. Now, I'm following up from the first question. Someone asked about Ireland and an island group, like how different are they? Now, in this assignment, in this exercise, there was a column that said island group and island and a few other things as well. Now, in the first question had Egypt, EGY, as the country code, S1 Nile River, and some coordinates. Now, so I was wondering, there's island group and island, but it feels like the emphasis here, the locality rather, should be Nile River, if I'm not wrong, if I'm correct. I don't know. Okay, so there's Nile River. So my question is every kind of locality, does every kind of locality have an island group description? Like, for instance, if we're to come up with Malawi, that's where I'm from. Do we belong to a certain or a specific island group or an island as well? Or is this pertinent to places that belong to an island? In this case, like if that's true, then in this case, it would make sense that these spaces were left blank. I don't know. Okay. Anyway, my question is a little bit vague, but I hope you help me.
No, it's an excellent question indeed, and it applies not only to these fields of island and island group, but also to every other Darwin core field. And the answer is no. Not every location has an island associated or an island group. And this goes to a broader concept that is, we don't have to fill in all Darwin core fields. We just have to fill in the ones that make sense and the ones that are applicable to the location that we're using. And so, for example, this is valid for island and island group. If we are not on an island, if the location is in the middle of a continental desert, island makes no sense to fill in. And equivalently, water body, if we're not referring to a lake, to a river, to an ocean, it makes no sense to fill in water body, and so on. So the message here is, even though we have a lot of fields in Darwin Core that allow us to share information, that doesn't mean that we have to make that information up. We just have to use them if the information is pertinent there, if the location refers or can be captured rather using those terms. Does this answer your question?
Yes, that helps a lot. Thank you.
Okay, John, do you want to add anything?
All good.
Okay. Any more questions from anyone at this point? Yes, Nestor, you've raised your hand.
Oh, thank you, Fola. I want to know if we have some practical case to solve together as class exercise, because we have many terms, and I think it's important we have some practical case to solve together. Maybe in next session, I don't know.
We will solve things together and discuss exercises on Friday during the Q&A session.
Okay,
that's a session that we're not going to explain any concepts in particular. We're not going to have a presentation, but it's going to be rather an open session so that we can discuss exercises that you were given. You can ask questions and we can solve things together, and it's that kind of dynamic for the questions and answers. The idea is that you all try to solve the exercises for this module before Friday, or at least to look at them, so that you can come with questions for all of us to discuss. But we will have that that instance exactly for that purpose. John?
Yeah, if these questions are specifically related to the pre-course exercise, what we could do is quickly run through our interpretations of those pre-course exercises, those mappings, and discuss those, if that's helpful. If those are still in question, let's say.
Okay, any more questions or comments for now? Otherwise, we will take a short break, 10 minutes. So I will leave on the chat the time that we will be back, but calculate 10 minutes. And we start with the next two topics. Are we good? Okay. Okay, see you all in 10 minutes. Please let me know if you can see. Excellent. The screen. Okay, so our next topic is going to be georeferencing methods. And during this talk, we're going to show you some different methods that we can use for georeferencing. And keep in mind that during this course, we're going to make emphasis on one of them in particular, which we're going to mention in a moment. So just as oh, wait a second. No, we're fine. Sorry. So just as a reminder, we have mentioned this before. What is georeferencing? If you need to review these concepts, you can go back to the previous module, module 1, in particular geographic concepts. But here we're going to repeat it so that we have it in mind. Georeferencing is assigning a numerical description to a location in a coordinate system that describes its extent and minimizes the associated uncertainties. So keep this definition in mind, because we're going to see how we can apply it when using different georeferencing methods. The georeferencing methods that we're going to mention here are the point method, the bounding box, the point radius, the shape or geometry, and the probability surface methods. Now, one observation here is that the point method is not a georeferencing method if we apply the definition that we have just reviewed. And this is because the point method does not take into account any kind of uncertainties. We're going to see this in detail in a moment. But we're going to show it here anyway, so that you understand what are the characteristics of these methods and what are the advantages and disadvantages of using one or the other. So the point method, what it does is it assigns a single pair of coordinates to a location. This means that it ignores that any location has an actual extent. It's an area. There is no location that is a point alone. And so it's ignoring that it has an extent. And so here you can see it graphically. We have this location in light blue, and we describe it by providing a single pair of coordinates, latitude and longitude. So some examples of this are this Lake Magadi. And if we had this location, the point method would give us just a pair of coordinates, probably on the center of it. Here we have another example, national park, we have a river and a whole country. If our location was a whole country, the point method will give us just a pair of coordinates, probably in the center, on the center of it. So you can see that a point does not take into account all the extent of the location that we're trying to describe. The next method is the bounding box method. The bounding box method provides two pairs of coordinates that define a rectangle, shown here at the bottom of the slide, containing the whole location. And so those pairs of coordinates are the vertices of that rectangle of minimal and maximum latitude and longitude. So the uncertainties here are represented in two dimensions, X and Y. And this is a simple case, the bounding box, of the shape method that we're going to see in a moment, and is in general an easy method to produce a georeference and to store compared to other more complex shapes. So for the same examples that we had before, if we wanted to represent the lake with a bounding box, we would draw a rectangle that contains the whole lake, and we would provide the pair of coordinates that define the vertices of that rectangle. Similarly, we could do that for the national park, for a whole river, or for a whole country. Now, there is another method, which is the one that we're going to focus on during this course, that is the point radius method. The point radius method provides a pair of coordinates and a distance, that is a radius, from that point to the circle that includes all the location and its uncertainties. The characteristic of this method is that, aside from providing a pair of coordinates, the uncertainties are represented in a single dimension with a single value, that is the radius. Using the same examples that we were looking at before, the point radius method applied to this lake will give us a pair of coordinates and a radius that includes all the uncertainties. The same for a national park, for a river, for a whole country. We could also apply the point radius method. The next method is the shape or geometry method, which is more complex than the rectangle, but is the general case of the bounding box of the rectangle, because what we do is provide one or more polygons or points with a buffer or polylines with a buffer. So in here we have this shape, and we start describing, we start providing different pairs of coordinates, latitude and longitude, that together define the whole shape of the location. So it's describing in detail the extent and the uncertainties of the location. So you will have many pairs of latitude and longitude coordinates to define this polygon. To see it graphically, for the lake, we would have all these little dots around the lake that define its shape. The same for the national park, and for the river, points on the river that define where the river is. The same for countries, or for any location that we will want to represent. And finally, the last method that we will mention is the probability surface method, that what it does is provide probability distributions for describing the sources of uncertainty. So it's giving us the probability of a location being at a particular pixel, given the uncertainties that we have. So in here, this shape, if we're describing this location with this shape on the screen, we see that we have different colors. We can visualize it with colors, and these colors will tell us the probability of the location being in that particular point within the the extent that we're defining considering the uncertainties. Let's go to the examples and maybe you can see it more clearly. If we have, for example, the national park and our location is national park, we have a probability, an equal probability of being anywhere in the park. Now, this, in the case of the lake, if we're exaggerating the visualization here, if we're saying that the location is, for instance, an aquatic location, that means it's in the lake. So we will probably have more probability of the location being represented in reality if we are at the center of the lake. And as we approach the coast, we're closer to the land, and therefore, if the location is aquatic, it's less probable that the land is the actual location. So we're considering uncertainties here. Again, this is exaggerated for the lake just for visualization, but we have different surfaces of probability for each one of the pixels here that indicate where the location actually is, considering the uncertainties. So similar cases we will have for rivers, for countries, or for any location that we're trying to georeference. Now, we've seen all these different methods: the point, the bounding box, the point radius, the shape, and the probability method. So which one do we choose? Well, our choice will depend on these three things on screen. First, the characteristics of the locations. Then the resource availability, because as we're going to see, some of these methods are more difficult to use or require more space to store the results. And so it will depend on the people that we have available to georeference, the amount of space in our computers that we have to store the results, etc., our resource availability. And also on the global objective of our georeferencing project. So let's make a quick comparison between all the methods that we have mentioned. With respect to veracity of the method, this is how well the method reflects reality. Well, we have seen that the point method is terrible at this because it's giving a single point for a location that always has an extent. In some cases, it's worse than in others, like for whole countries, providing a single point is really terrible. For smaller places might not be as bad, but in general terms, the veracity of the point method is very bad. On the other extreme, we have the probability method, which is the best at representing or reflecting reality. And then we have the point radius is a bit bad at veracity, depending on the shape of the location that we're going to georeference. We're going to see an example on the next slides. And the bounding box does a little better, again, depending on the shape of the location. The shape method is pretty good at reflecting reality because we're providing all the little dots around the location that we're representing. So, as I was saying before, the point radius here in the middle and the bounding box, some of them do better or worse depending on the shape and orientation of the location. And let's look at these examples. If we have a lake here that is more or less round, we can more or less a circle, approximate it to a circle, we see here that the point radius is this circle here. And when we use a circle to represent that location, we have some spaces here marked in red that we know are not the lake, right? And so we're overestimating the size of that location. If we use a rectangle, a bounding box, we also overestimate. And in this case, we see that that overestimation is a little bigger here in yellow for this location. So If the shape of the location is more round, then the point radius method does better than the bounding box. In contrast to that, if the shape is elongated, that like this other lake here, the Lago Rupanco, this is in Chile. If we use the bounding box here, we can see it down here, the overestimation of this method is very little because of how this lake is in shape. And if we use instead the point radius method, we're using a circle that it goes way beyond the actual lake. So here we can see that using different methods, we overestimate more or less depending on the shape of the location. Now, comparing the other two methods, that is the shape and the probability methods, the difference between those two in how they do with respect to veracity will depend on the type of locality that we're using. And so, for example, here we have represented the a given town, and our location is X kilometers away from that town. And so if we use the shape method, we can define X kilometers away from that town all around it. It looks kind of like a buffer. And it could be, the shape will give us a surface here where anywhere here, anywhere on this, the location could be. Now, if we use the probability method, this will give us different probabilities within that buffer where the location can actually be. Because the further we go to the limit, is the less probable that we're actually representing the location in reality. So in these cases, for offset locality, the probability method is more veracious than the shape method. Now that we have compared veracity, let's look at how these methods do for speed. That is, how fast can we apply these methods? Well, the point method is pretty easy to use, and it's just providing a set of coordinates for each location. So that's very fast. It's the fastest that you can do. The bounding box follows the point method because we only have to draw a rectangle, and that is usually simple to do. Next, we have the point radius, and the shape and the probability methods are the slowest to perform. The shape, because we have to be drawing every single little dot that describes the shape, and the probability is the same. And besides, we have to calculate probabilities for each of the pixels. So you can see that the speed of the methods are pretty different. Then the other characteristics is storing. How much space do we need to store the results? Well, as we were saying, the point method is only a set of coordinates, so we only need to store latitude and longitude. And what we're going to see a little more in the next slide, but the probability one is the worst, and the shape because we have a lot of information to store. So in this example for Benin, we have, if we provide a single point, we have a single pair of coordinates, latitude, longitude. If we use the bounding box, we have 2 points, latitude, longitude, latitude, longitude. So that's 4 values. If we use the point radius method, we have latitude and longitude and the radius. So that's 3 values. And if we use the shape and the probabilities, we have for the shape several, we can have thousands of points of latitude and longitude. And for the probability method, we have a probability for each pixel plus a raster where to plot this, where to set it on. So you can see that the storing space that we need varies a lot between methods. The next point for comparison is the ease of use, is how easy it is for us once we have the results to actually use them. So the point method, the bounding box, and the point radius are pretty much easy to use. and the shape and the probability ones are more difficult to use because we usually need specialized software to be able to plot these georeferences and to use them after the fact. And finally, we're going to talk about the utility of each method. Well, the utility of the point method is very narrow because we only have a point representing a location that can be very, very large. And so we cannot say much about that location really, or get any conclusions. We're going to see an example with, if we would try to use point georeferences, for instance, for niche modeling. And then we have, well, the bounding box is a little more useful than the point one, but not that much. And on the other extreme, we have the probability and the shape methods, which are very useful. And here the probability is that we're saying it's a little less useful, but because of how it is built and its ease of use is complicated to apply to many applications. Sorry for the redundancy there. So with this table comparing all methods, which method do we choose? Well, we try to balance all these different characteristics. And based on that balance is that we're going to focus on this course on the point radius method. So now to the example that I was mentioning before, an example to show why the point method, for instance, is not very helpful for some applications. So this little bird here is a honey eater that is native to southeastern Australia, and that it lives in within its distribution in a particular promontory national park, the Wilson's Promontory National Park. And in this example, what we want to do is perform a niche modeling study. So that is, we want to understand where the bird is distributed with respect to some environmental variables, precipitation, temperature, etc. So let's think that we have a locality description. The locality description that is this Wilson promontory for this bird. So for this locality description that we have, that is at the very top of the screen, our locality description is Wilson's Promontory, Australia. On the map, this is the Wilson's Promontory. And we can, looking at the promontory on a map, obtain a pair of coordinates for that promontory in the center of that promontory. If we were using the point method, we will only provide a pair of coordinates, latitude, longitude, that's it. So thinking about our goal, that is to niche model to make a niche model for the species, for that point, we go and gather the elevation data, the temperature of the coldest month, the mean annual precipitation. And so we have these values and say, oh, wow, this little bird lives here with these environmental characteristics. That is what we would get if we provided just a point. Now, if we look at the promontory, we can see that actually those environmental characteristics are not homogeneous throughout the whole promontory. And so if instead of using a point to define that location, we used a point radius, we would see that if the bird lives here in the promontory, it's not living at a single set of environmental characteristics, but rather on a range of them. So we see that in the whole promontory, the elevation actually goes from 0 to more than 500 meters. That the temperature of the coldest month varies in 3 degrees Celsius, and that the mean annual precipitation also varies a lot from 65 to 107 millimeters. So we can see that if we were left with a single point, we would not really be representing the environment where this little bird actually lives. So you can see that for certain applications is of other importance to consider the uncertainties that the locations have, because otherwise we are misrepresenting the data that we have, the location data that we actually have, and therefore down the line in the application, in this case in each model, we will be making probably huge mistakes. So with that said, when choosing a method, it is important to keep a couple of things in mind. First, always report the method employed. It is very important because whoever comes to use those data after needs to know which method you used. Also to be able to understand if those data are usable or not for other purposes. Then, for choosing a method, ponder the advantages and disadvantages. As we said before, this might depend on the resources that you have available. For instance, if you're going to georeference a whole museum collection and you only have one person to do it, you'll probably not choose to use the shape or the probability method, because those are so time consuming that you're never going to finish the project. Then we can use more than one method. This means if we have a data set with biodiversity records, it's not obligatory to always use the same method for every location. We can use different methods for each one. And we can also use combination of methods. And we can also, and should also, use other types of information to narrow the locations. We're going to see how to do that when we see the point radius method in particular. But what is important is that you don't have to marry any method in particular. You can use whichever, as long as you report the method that you have employed. So, coming back a little bit to the Darwin core terms that John was explaining earlier today, if we were using the point method, where will we capture that information? Well, the point method has a pair of coordinates, so we would capture that in decimal latitude and decimal longitude, and we will need the coordinates reference system, or the datum, that correspond to those coordinates. So we will use geodetic datum field to capture that information. If we were using the point radius method, we would also use decimal latitude and longitude to record the coordinates. We will use the geodetic datum to capture the coordinate reference system, and we will need to capture the net uncertainty, that is the radius of that circle that we were seeing before, and the field that we will use is coordinate uncertainty in meters. Something that is important is that that radius that we will be reporting in this field is the final calculated one. That means once we have actually done the georeference, which we're going to explain in our next modules, how to do that. If we're using the bounding box and the shape methods, we will capture the shape. Remember that the bounding box is a simple case of a shape. And we will capture that shape in footprint WKT. Refer to the previous part of this session for all the definitions of these fields. And we will capture the coordinate reference system or datum in footprint SRS term. Then, something important for all methods, no matter which one you use, you always have to explicitly indicate the methods, all the sources of information that we have used, and every criteria that we used when we were georeferencing. You will see that when you get a location and you have to georeference it, you will have to make some decisions and take some criteria. All those criteria and decisions need to be documented. And the fields that we will use in Darwin Core are georeference protocol, georeference sources and georeference remarks, which were explained by John earlier today. So with this, we have gone through a series of georeferencing methods that are available to you. And we're going to pass now to our next presentation that is about georeferencing best practices. Do we have anything on the chat that I should be aware of? Okay. So let me go to our next presentation. And sharing my screen again. Please let me know when you see it. Okay. So having had that introduction to georeferencing methods, we're going to talk about what are the best practices for georeferencing. And with best practices for georeferencing, I'm not just referring to the georeferencing process itself, but to the bigger picture of georeferencing, from stating a georeferencing project down to actually georeferencing records. And so the principles of best practice, and these are described in Chapman and Wieczorek georeferencing best practices. John might send you the link to that document on the chat. These principles are the ones that are shown on the screen and that we're going to see in detail, but are accuracy, effectiveness, efficiency, reliability, accessibility, transparency, timeliness, relevance, replicability, and adaptability. So let's start with accuracy. Accuracy means how well the data represent the truth. That is, if we're having a georeference, how well does that georeference represent the true location? Accuracy includes considerations taken both when the location was recorded, for example, in the field by the collector of a specimen, and when it is georeferenced. We have to be careful with precision here, because lack of precision will signify that we have less accuracy. This is, again, both when we're taking the notes, that we're writing down the location of the field, and when we're georeferencing. The next principle is effectiveness. And effectiveness, we're thinking here more about a project, a georeferencing project or program, and is the likelihood that a work program achieves its objectives, right? So, for example, if we are georeferencing a data set, is how many of those records in the data set can actually be accurately georeferenced, or how many can we provide coordinates and uncertainty. Then there is efficiency, and efficiency is related to the effort that we need to put to produce an acceptable georeference in this case. And this is much related to what we were talking about, resources available just a moment ago. Our next principle is reliability. And this means the confidence that we have in that this georeference, this information about georeferences that we produce, is repeatable and consistent. And this includes as well how reliable are the sources and methods that we're using. For example, if we're using Wikipedia for getting information about a particular location to be able to georeference, well, is Wikipedia reliable? Okay, can we trust what it says? Well, that's included in this reliability of sources. Same for maps and for gazetteers, etc. Then we have the principle accessibility. Accessibility means how easy it is for users to find and use the information, in this case, the georeferencing information. And for accessibility, we should be following the FAIR principles of data. That means that data are findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. This guarantees that people can access and use the data that we produce. And then there is a very big principle that is transparency. And this has to do with the clarity and completeness of the inputs and processes that we use to produce the georeference, produce our result. So it is very important, and this going back to what we have already said many times, that is, it is very important to report all the sources that we use, to report the methods that we use, to report the criteria or the decisions that we have taken during georeferencing. And then there are two other principles, which are timeliness. This refers to the frequency with which we're collecting data or reporting it or updating it. And in particular, with respect to georeferencing, for instance, if we're using gazetteers, how often are those gazetteers updating? And then after we georeference, how long after we georeference we're sharing the records? Could have anything changed in between? Are we updating those records? Are we receiving feedback and incorporating that feedback? So this all has to do with the timeliness of our process. And then there is the relevance, that is the relative pertinence and usability of the data. And here we have to talk about a concept that is fitness for use or fitness for purpose. That means, or that implies, that data can be used for many different uses, some of them that we cannot anticipate. And so whether data are relevant or not depends on the use that we're going to give it. So for example, if I only want to know if a species occurs in a country, well, I just probably need a latitude, longitude inside that country. Now, if I'm going to do niche modeling, we have seen that we need much more than just a little dot on the map. So depending on the use is the relevance that different data can have. And then we have replicability. That is, can we reproduce the result that we're seeing, the georeference that we have? And this is ensured by what I was saying before, and I will repeat once again, of reporting the methods, reporting the sources, etc. Because that's the only way in which anyone after the fact can look at a georeference and reproduce it. And then we have adaptability. That is the potential of the data to be reused for new purposes. So if we provide a georeference that doesn't have enough documentation, well, that georeference might be useful for our purpose now, but for some purpose in the future might not. And it would have been a difference between providing the source or not, providing more information or not. So we have to be as thorough as we can so that those data have the potential to be reused. And what we're going to set here is, in particular, if we're trying to make a best practice document, this is relevant here because this course is a train the trainers. And so you're going to train other people, and you will probably need to build some documentation to explain how the process of georeference is going to be performed in at your institution. And so for this georeferencing best practice documents, there are some important things to consider. That is, if you're building these documents, you need to align the vision, mission, and strategic plans in your institution to the policies of your place and the procedures, and try to gain support of sponsors and top management. You should use a standard method of writing. You should satisfy industry standards. Your document should satisfy scrutiny of management and either external or internal auditors. And you should try your best to adhere to relevant standards and biodiversity informatics practices. So again, this is important if you're building documentation for your institution or if you're setting up a georeferencing project in the future. So this is a reminder of something that we've seen on Monday, module 1, or at the very end of geographic concepts. We mentioned that there are a set of sources of uncertainty. And so this is important to take into account, particularly when we're capturing and recording data. So the sources of uncertainty that will affect our georeferences are the location extent, the coordinate uncertainty, the unknown datum, not knowing which datum it is, because as we have seen, coordinates alone without a datum can be way off. The GPS accuracy if we're using GPS to get coordinates, and imprecision in distance and heading measurements. I invite you to review this, what we have said before in module 1 about these uncertainty sources. But they are important to keep in mind when we're capturing and recording georeferencing data. Also, we have talked about elements of a good locality description, which are the verbal locality description, the extent, the coordinates, the spatial reference system, the GPS, if we're using GPS, the vertical components, and the offset heading and distance. So again, these are important elements when we are capturing the data and later georeferencing it. So for the verbal locality description, the verbal locality description should function as an independent validation of the georeference. This means that if we have a georeference, for instance, with a point radius method that has a set of coordinates and a radius, the uncertainty associated with that location. If we also have a verbal locality description, we can always cross-check whether those two correspond to each other. So in that sense, it's an independent validation of the georeference. So it is important that the verbal locality description is a good one. And again, always keep the verbatim locality description at hand. Also, this description should be as specific, succinct, unequivocal, precise, and complete as possible, so that there is no space for multiple interpretations. If we're using reference points in this verbal locality description, those reference points should be stable, both in position and size, over time. So it's a very bad idea to use a tree as a reference point, for instance, which we have seen done. And those reference points should also be small in size, as much as possible, and easy to find on maps and gazetteers so that anyone could find them and could not mistake them for something else. The most specific localities are those that are described by distances from two distinct paths with a nearby well-defined intersection, or distances along orthogonal directions from a persistent small feature that is nearby. If we're including a path, it is important to record whether distances on that path, on a route, on a river, or any path, whether distances are following that path or on a straight line by air, for instance. Now, about the extent, it is important to specify the reference point within the feature. For example, when we are determining the extent or it is typical that we have coordinates for a town, and those coordinates can be at the post office or at the school or at the geographic center of the town. So having those reference points really clear is very important. The extent of places can change over time. And here you see an example, Kitimu. at different years. And you can see that if we were to define the town, we would probably define it pretty differently from one year to another. So it has grown over time. And with this in mind, it's important to consider that the locations that will be georeferencing come from biodiversity records that have a collection or observation date. During this project, we're not going to take into account that date, but ideally we should, because of this, because places can change over time. And so if a collector collected a bird, for instance, in this town this year, he or she would have probably been referring to this space when he described the location, but in some other year, it could be referring to a very different place or much bigger place or much smaller or different. In the case of rivers that change courses, it is very difficult to determine where the location is without considering the collection date. Then another consideration is if using measurement devices like camera traps or sound recorders, the extent should include their coverage and not just the actual position, the coordinates that define where the camera was, but also how much can the camera see. Some best practices regarding coordinates. Decimal coordinates provide a succinct format and have only 3 attributes: latitude, longitude, and the coordinate reference system. Those decimal coordinates are ready for us to make geographic analysis, and usually are of global application. Anyone can use it. So this is a good format to provide the coordinates, and it's the one that is recommended in Darwin Core for decimal latitude and decimal longitude. So it is very important that we always include the precision, all precision decimal places given by the coordinate source. We have talked about this before. You can review it, and we have also seen this in the pre-course exercises. As mentioned the other day, if we're using UTM coordinates, we should always capture the zone, and we should always record the coordinate reference system or data. In particular, about precision, we have to be careful, because when we are using coordinates with less precision, we have more uncertainty. So here in this example, the green dot has coordinates provided to the nearest degree, 49 north and 3 west. Okay, the point is here. Now, if we provide those coordinates to the nearest half degree, 49.5, 2.5, that coordinate is actually on Guernsey. So we see that it has changed its position quite a bit. Actually, it was in the middle of the ocean, and now it's on an island. And if we provide the precision to the nearest 10th of a degree, again, we have a movement. So you see that the uncertainty is bigger when we record coordinates with low precision. For example, the point was actually here, and if we are less precise in the coordinates, we end up way off the actual location that we're trying to represent. We have to be careful also about false precision when storing the data or transferring it. Be careful when we convert from one format of coordinates to another, because that can create false precision. And then also about the coordinates, the uncertainty, we have to take into account that a degree, particularly in latitude, does not represent the same distance on Earth. We have mentioned some of this when we talk about projections. And so you see that 1 degree difference nearest the equator is a much shorter distance than near the poles. So we have to be very careful with this as well. With respect to coordinate reference systems, and we're going to repeat this thousands of times, except from some special cases, that is when we are at the very poles of the Earth. Except for those cases, coordinates without a coordinate reference system do not specify a unique location. The errors that we can have by not knowing the datum that we're using or the coordinate reference system that we're using can go up to 5.4 kilometers, which is quite a bit. So always important to report a datum, or if we don't know it, to consider that we don't know it when we calculate the uncertainty associated to a location. Also, it is recommended to record the EPSG code of that coordinate reference system, the datum or ellipsoid. If none of those can be determined from the coordinate source, we have to say that it's not recorded and take it into account when calculating the net uncertainty for that location. Some considerations if we're using GPS data. This might be even more relevant for when we're capturing the location information in the field. We have to always consider climatic and environmental conditions because the measurements of GPS depend on it. We have to configure the GPS to the preferred datum or coordinate reference system, and always write down which coordinate reference system we're using on the GPS. We should configure also the device to capture decimal coordinates, and obviously always record coordinates, datum, and the accuracy of the GPS when writing down the data. And it's also recommended, as we were saying before, to provide a verbal description that accompanies those coordinates, because that's our independent reference, the thing that we can use to check if those coordinates actually make sense. About the vertical components, some recommendations. Vertical components can be obtained from several sources, both while we are in the field collecting or observing species, or they can be estimated afterwards using elevation digital models or Google Earth or Google Maps. We have to be careful with the vertical components. If we're measuring in the field, instruments need to be calibrated, and the measures that GPS devices give, are to this day not very trustworthy. So careful with the vertical components. In any case, it doesn't matter if you do it from the GPS or estimate it afterward from some model. You have to always record the method that you used to obtain that elevation. And the vertical datum that method is using as a reference. So as we were seeing on module 1, remember that determining the elevation is not the same if we're using as a reference the ellipsoid or the geoid. So we will have very different values of elevations on some parts of the world. So it is important to report the vertical datum that we're using. Recommendations for offsets, directions, and distances. We have to keep in mind that the true north is not the same as the magnetic north on Earth. So if we're using apps or devices to determine offsets, we have to make sure that we configure the device to either one or the other and document it. Then, to avoid ambiguity, especially in location descriptions, we have to be specific in the wording. It is not the same to say north of or to the north of. For example, north of Bariloche, that is where I live, could be outside Bariloche to the north or the north part of Bariloche. So north of is quite ambiguous. So we have to be careful with that. Then it is recommended that we indicate headings in degrees from the north. So instead of saying north is 0 degrees north, if it's straight to the north. And if we're north but a little bit, but we don't get to northeast, and well, the best way, the most specific way is to actually assign and report the degrees in any given direction. Then avoid providing directions without distances, because that is north of, and north of can be from this place to the pole. And avoid providing distances without directions, like 5 kilometers from Bariloche. Well, 5 kilometers where? In which direction? That makes it much more uncertain when it needs not be. To take into account the uncertainty associated with offsets, directions, and distances increases with distance. So I'll give you an example here. We're Lambert Center of Australia, here at this little point, and we say X distance northeast. So we're moving on this line in the middle, right? Northeast, if we say northeast, we have a chance of being mistaken to the northeast or to the east-northeast. Now, if we say 5 kilometers northeast, we come 5 kilometers, and our error to the sides could be, to one side or the other, this yellow arrow here marked with a Y. That will be error associated with the location description that is 5 kilometers northeast of Lambert Center of Australia. Now, if the location was 10 kilometers northeast, we're moving further away. Now check that if we were mistaken in the direction, the error associated increases quite a bit, here marked with an X. So the further we go in the offset, the more divergence we have in the error that we can commit associated with direction. So be very careful with that. And then, again, describing localities along a path or with distances in orthogonal directions is the best way of describing location, because it removes uncertainty due to direction imprecision. So we're going to mention now what a georeferencing workflow should look like. This thinking again about a georeferencing project. And during this course, we're going to focus on some particular steps of that georeferencing workflow, sorry. So what we should first do is choose a georeferencing method. This we can do at the dataset level for the whole project or for each record in particular. This depends on the dynamics of our project. Once we have chosen a georeferencing method, we need to analyze the locality, the location in particular that we have, and typify its parts. That is, remember the types of locations that John was explaining during the first module of the course. We have to understand which type of location we have. We have then to identify entities or features and determine the locality type of the most specific part of it. Then find those features in a spatial data source, in a gazetteer, in a map, in other sources. We have to determine their boundaries and the extent of those features. And then we have to follow a protocol for georeferencing that location, depending on the type of locality that it is. And finally, once we have georeferenced the location, we have to report that georeference and document the sources and methods in full. So this is the georeferencing workflow that we will be following during this course and after, during the project, the mother project. And we will see each of these steps in detail in the next modules. So with this, we have finished with the general principles of best practices that are related to different aspects of georeferencing. It is important that you go to the publication that is behind this best practices, which is Chapman and Wieczorek, Georeferencing Best Practices. In there, you will have all the details. It has been a very brief introduction to the principles and some tips on particular components that make up the locations and their georeferences. But I recommend that you take a look at that document because you will find a lot of very important information there. So with this, I will stop sharing the screen. And now I will, unless there is any particular comment right now, I will stop the recording.